Welcome to the Voice of Russia's weekly international panel where London links up with Moscow and Washington, D.C. In London, I'm Scott Craig. On today's programme, we're looking at Syria after the G8, with the war in Syria overshadowing the official G8 agenda and a lack of consensus between Russia and the West over how to tackle the crisis. What's next for Syria? The G8 members signed up to a statement on Syria calling for an end to the bloodshed. But over the main stumbling block, the future of Bashar al-Assad, no compromise was found. As usual, we've assembled an international panel to look at the story from all sides. We'll be hearing from Dmitry Babych in our Moscow studio and Rick Young in our Washington studio and their guests. Here in London, John Higginson, the political editor of the Metro newspaper, is here with me. And John, let me start with you first, as the G8 wrapped up here in London, here in the UK on Tuesday. Britain seems to be taking a more vocal line on Syria. Why do you think Britain is taking such a tough line, given that the UK public is probably not in favour of a further military involvement in the Middle East? Supporting arms shipments to the rebels is a fairly radical move in itself, would you say?
It is indeed. I think one of the things you have to realise is that Britain has always aligned itself with America. Cameron is as keen as his predecessor, Tony Blair, was to be friends with America. And when Barack Obama said that the red line for them was if evidence was found of chemical warfare, when this evidence that I haven't myself seen, but apparently there is evidence there, Cameron's decided to back Barack Obama on this. As you say, it's not something that his own party backbenchers want. It's not something that the coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats, want, and it's not something that the public want. The public just aren't keen on getting involved in another foreign mission like this that could possibly come back to Britain, infuse homegrown British Muslims to think that yet again Britain's stamping its weight around, and I'm of that opinion as well. I just think this is something that, if something was going to be done, should have been done a long time ago. It's a war that's been going on now for 2 years. It's becoming increasingly sectarian. The rebels appear to have large amounts of Al-Qaeda sympathisers, and I think it's something that we shouldn't. It's a fire that we should not be throwing more guns into at this stage.
If we look at the politics of how this plays out in terms of the diplomacy that we were seeing at the G8, the final communique makes no reference at all to the future of Assad. That was the main stumbling block, one of the main stumbling blocks between Russia and the West. You have that on the one hand. On the other hand, you have David Cameron saying that it's unthinkable that the future Syria will involve President Assad. How can you reconcile those two things? Because they're seemingly entirely contradictory.
Well, this is one of the big problems. President Putin seems to be much more willing than other world leaders are to stamp his authority in cases like this. You had seven of the G8 members all on one side, him apparently on the other. But it is this desperately sad situation. Where do we go from here? How do you can you see Assad as a leader, someone who's potentially gassed his own people? That does seem impossible. But I think what we do want to see, and what we did see in that communique, which is hopefully none of the leaders wanted to look as if they were giving anything away. Putin wants to walk away looking like he was strong, he's got his way. The other leaders want to look as if they're strong and they've got their way. But what we might have is a situation, if we can have a government in place so that Assad can step away while not looking too embarrassed, some kind of situation that he can be offered a deal. That is the only possible solution I can see to a violent, going on for years, civil war that has no end.
Well, Dmitry Babych is in our Moscow studio. Let me hand over to you, Dmitry, at this phase.
So my question is to my guest here, Nikolay Surkov. Nikolay, you are an Arabist by education, and you have been covering that region for Независимая Gazeta, and you have been covering what's going on there for a number of years now. Is Russia really so keen on Assad as the Western press presents it? And whom does Russia support in Syria? Does it support Assad personally, or is it the principle of sovereignty?
Well, you have to look at this situation on a broader scale. Russian foreign policy now is very conservative. Russia supports status quo, which is much safer and much better for the stability, not only in the region, but in the world as a whole. And Russia is absolutely not pleased with America or Western countries meddling in regional affairs and putting on fire countries which are very close to us, very close to Russian southern borders. So in case of Syria, it's not Assad, though people in Syria, for example, they think that Russia has some affection for Assad on some very funny basis. But on the other hand, Assad is not that important for Russia. For Russia, regional stability is the primary goal, because many people know that jihadists from Russia go to Syria and then they come back and begin their propaganda, begin terrorist activity, not only in the northern Caucasus, but also in Tatarstan and other regions. So we have this problem of jihadism, which will be intensified due to more and more conflicts in Syria and in other countries of the region. And we also have to note that Russia doesn't see any positive results of the Arab Spring, of any Western involvement in the affairs of the region. Take Libya, an example, which is still unstable. Take Egypt, whose fate is undecided.
Yes.
So many problems now exist in the region, and there are no solutions.
Well, let me develop this theme here. It seems to me that we have kind of a misunderstanding between Russian media and Russian politicians and the Western press. Russia has been saying many times that it doesn't support Assad personally. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov criticized Assad for a lack of progress on democracy on several occasions. But still, the more Russia speaks about its not being so much involved with Assad, the more often you read in the Western press that Russia is a staunch ally of Assad, that Russia has engaged itself completely on the side of the Syrian government. There were even reports that Russia sends not only arms but even money to keep Assad afloat. Why is that misunderstanding? How can Russia break this wall of misunderstanding, if you want?
Well, the only way to break this wall is, first of all, to convince the public in the West that we are not really chasing any kind of economic or political interest in Syria. And besides, if Western governments acknowledge that Russia is not supporting Assad, then they have to acknowledge that Russia is really very concerned with the regional stability, and that they were wrong in their actions. So
breaking that stability.
Yes, exactly. So the only way for the West is to continue insisting that Russia is fighting for Assad, that Russia is doing its best to support Assad. But still, just people don't want to acknowledge that they were mistaken. Now many media people in the United States, in Europe, they do point out that jihadists profited from this situation, that instability is growing, and nothing really positive comes out of it. So, but if you acknowledge that, then you have to acknowledge that Russia was right. The only way to avoid this, to say that Russia is fighting for Assad, that Russia wants an autocrat, but it's not true.
Yeah, I think here we better pass the word to Washington to find out if it's really true that there are more and more doubting voices in Washington. So I pass the word to my colleague Rick Young in Washington. Rick, you have the word.
Well, thanks. Thank you, Dmitry. Our guest here in the Washington studios, Dr. Dean Ahmed. He's the president of the Minaret of Freedom Institute. He's also a lecturer, senior lecturer at the University of Maryland, and he teaches a course on the Islamic religion, author of the book Signs in the Heavens, A Muslim Astronomer's Perspective on Religion and Science. Doctor, thanks for joining us. You've heard both of the guests in London and in Moscow. Overall, when you take a look at what's been happening recently, the Obama administration says there apparently is, they feel, there's evidence of chemical warfare, and that's the red line in which President Obama says that the Syrian government should not have crossed. And now there's questions whether indeed this is real evidence or is this not real.
Well, unfortunately, they've not shared that evidence with me, so I can't evaluate it. If they have shared it with Mr. Putin, they haven't convinced him. What I think is clear is that there is some good evidence that some sarin gas has been used by somebody in Syria. But the quantity seems to be so small that it doesn't serve the purposes of either side from a military. It's planted simply in order to evoke a reaction. If so, which side has the motive to plant it? Not Assad, since it gives him no military advantage, but only opens up the possibility of, at a minimum, armaments to his opposition. And therefore, we have to guess that it is most likely someone who's trying to create a justification for the kind of intervention that is being discussed now. I think that it's kind of amusing to me in watching the way that the different sides are lining up of the members of the G8, that we're seeing kind of a reversal of what we saw during the Soviet era. I remember that Russia's view towards Assad reminds me of Kennedy's view of Trujillo. John F. Kennedy said that Trujillo was and he used a term I'm not going to repeat here, it was an expletive. He said he's an expletive, but he's our expletive. And I think that it is true that Russia doesn't so much care about keeping Assad in power as it does maintaining its rather good relationship with Syria, very critical state in the Middle East, and right now the closest state to Russia in the Arab world. So I think that the most important leverage that can be exerted on the Assad regime is the military aid that the Russians are giving to Syria now. I think that's more important than any potential aid that the West might give to the rebels. All that's going to do, introducing more aid to the rebels is only going to increase the number of civilian casualties, which is supposedly the reason for introducing the aid. So it's really quite illogical. On the other hand,
there was also some talk that if you aid certain factions of the rebels, that it will somehow even out the firepower, right?
Well, in principle, you might be able to do that, but only if you're willing to give weapons that I'm sure that the West is not willing to give to the rebels. So that seems like a straw man kind of argument.
But getting back to the G8, though, you make a good point about there's a lot of talk here, and everyone wants to stabilize the situation, okay? But the present situation is not stable given what's been happening.
That's correct. And as I said, I don't think that any of the proposals that are being made are going to increase the stability, certainly not in the short term. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that it would increase it in the long term, but I have my doubts about that. Look at what happened with the intervention in Iraq. People might say that, well, yes, things were very bad for a short while, but things are better now. Well, I don't know that anyone really believes that things are that much better now. The names have changed, but the fault lines have only become more severe. The sectarian violence has arisen in Iraq that wasn't there before. And certainly in Syria, we know that's one of the biggest dangers. A number of people, one thing about Assad, he may be a dictator, but he's pretty much oppressive across the board, and actually has been somewhat gentler to some of the minorities than some of the other Arab dictators have been. I don't think they're looking forward, not just the Alawites, but I think the Shias in general. I think that the Christians, I think that even some people Muslims whose interpretation of Islam may not be in accord with whoever ends up being in power, are worried about what's going to happen next.
So the bottom line with the G8 at this point, in your opinion, is the G8 can do what at this point, if anything?
I don't know what they can do. I would say this: if someone would ask me to advise them in the G8, I would say that someone should sit down from the Western powers and talk to the Russians and say, what is it that we can come up with that would be a compromise that would convince you to stop arming Assad in exchange for some assurance that we could give that we're not trying to flip Syria into the Western column, that we really seriously are just trying to put an end to the civilian casualties. I think if you would make that approach, it at least opens up the possibility for a favorable Russian response. Now, of course, the ball would then be in Russia's court, and they might not respond in a favorable way, but at least you give them the opportunity to do so. Whereas the current pitches that are being made allow us to send more arms to the rebels or put in a no-fly zone or any one of the number of suggestions are things that I think are not on the table for Russia.
Okay, let's go back to London and Scott.
I wanted to talk to you more about the opposition in Syria, the rebels themselves, who they actually are. I was at the G8 and I went to the press briefing given by Vladimir Putin. And in those remarks, one thing that really leapt out was he drew a comparison between the people who murdered drummer Lee Rigby. For our international listeners, it was drummer Lee Rigby was a soldier who was murdered in the streets of London, allegedly by two men who are Islamic extremists. He drew a parallel between that and arming the opposition in Syria, saying while they weren't all extremists, there were many extremists within their ranks, and Western leaders should think carefully about arming them. Is it, in your view, as stark as that, or is that kind of overstating the case?
No, I think President Putin had a very good point there, and I think that resonated with British people who are sceptical about arming the rebels. If you see some of the footage of rebels, I think what we've got a problem with at the moment is there are branches of people interpreting the Quran, especially young people, all over the world, in the Western world as well. And wherever there's flare-ups, if you remember 2 years ago when these when the Arab Spring first started, we all thought, oh look, this will be brilliant. All these dictators will be overthrown, and all these countries will turn just like these Western democracies. It hasn't happened like that. Part of the problem is you hear British accents fighting for the rebels. You'll hear accents from other countries, because as soon as you get a country flaring up, people from Muslim people whose views are much harder, much more right-wing than their parents, are going to these countries fighting for them. And it's exactly right. The view is that there's that there's some kind of war on between them and the West, Muslims and Christianity. I suspect it all started with Palestine and Israel, and it's all come from there. And there's this feeling amongst some Muslims that they're being trodden upon, that somehow the Westerners have a crusade that they're doing, that they want to turn the whole rest of the world into them. And so this is the point that President Putin was making, that these people are in many ways one and the same. They're having a war against the West, and that's why these guys killed this guy in Woolwich to get this message across. Their tactics are brutal. You've got this chap Abu Sakar who's killed a soldier, eaten his heart, and then put it out on YouTube. It's very similar tactics to we saw in Afghanistan, we saw by Al-Qaeda, of getting their message out by cheap means to the public, and then that message gets seen by someone maybe sitting in their bedroom in Birmingham. They might be in a home with very liberal Muslim parents who have come to Britain. They might have come to America, and they want to make a new life for themselves. And these young people aren't taking on those views of their parents, and they're saying, yeah, this is right. This guy's got a point here, and I think some of those people have got into the rebel camp, and and it's a large enough number that we have to be very careful. You can't suddenly go, we're going to arm the moderate rebels, but those arms won't get to the more extreme rebels, the people that don't believe that women should be allowed out in public without man, that are homophobic, that believe that gay people should be killed. Those kind of extreme views. You can't say to one person, here's a gun, but don't give it to that guy standing next to you who's willing to fight on your side. And that's a really big problem we have here.
But don't you have to, I mean, the other side of that coin is you have to aid the moderates in order to combat the extremists.
Well, what I'd like to see more is I don't think you can aid the... I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can aid moderates and it not go to extremists. If two people are fighting and they're being bombed by Assad, the moderate isn't going to say to the other guy, "Oh, what are your views on women being let out? Oh, you're a bit too extreme for me. I'm not going to give you these guns here." They will filter straight through. So I think the way forward is for the whole world to put pressure on Assad, on the regime, to have those eyes there to say, we are watching you, all parties come round the table, stop fighting each other, stop killing each other. I think that's the only way forward. Throwing more guns and weapons to each side is not going to resolve this problem.
It has to be solved diplomatically. That's essentially what you're saying. The diplomatic process, though, seems to be stalled in essence. Dmitry, Babych, maybe this is a good point at which to come back to you in Moscow.
Mr. Higginson has just said, I think these are very right arguments. And I want to be a bit polemical here. So I would return to what Dean Ahmed has said before in his really brilliant presentation. He said that at the moment that probably the Westerners and the Russians should sit down and they should agree on a settlement that Russia would not arm Assad if its interests in East Syria are respected. Well, I don't know, Nikolay, you may not agree with me, but my impression is that Russia's interest in Syria should not be overestimated. You know, that naval base in Tartus is actually not a very big object. I heard that there were just maybe 10 or 15 people running it. So what's your take on that? Do you think really that Russia is so concerned about its influence in Syria that it's ready to to worsen its relations with Western countries and risk isolation in the name of its interest in Syria?
Say that not only Syria, but the Middle East as a whole is not that important for Russia economically or militarily. It's not the Cold War era nowadays. Russia doesn't need strategic bases. It doesn't need strategic presence in this region. What Russia really needs is stability in the region in order not to get more jihadists. But still, speaking about Syria, well, economic interests are very limited because trade was done mostly with Syrian trade was mostly with Europe, with the European Union. Syrian exports went to the European Union. All we had was about 1 billion of direct investments, which were transformed from the debt, which we had to sign off, about $11 billion. So
mostly the Soviet era debt.
Yes, the Soviet era debt. Then even the volume of of weapons trade was very limited because Syrians, they can't pay for any sophisticated weapons. So the country is not rich enough for that. You can't compare Syria with India or with China, who are the main customers for Russian defense industry. So taking all these into consideration, you have to look for political motives of Russia's behavior, which I've already explained before.
So Russia is more fighting for principle there, if we can really call it a fight, because it's really a rather passive attitude.
Well, Russia is not fighting, but it's standing for a principle.
I think that's the right word.
Standing for a principle, and it wants its Western counterparts, its Western countries to behave in a more responsible way, because now the West is behaving absolutely irresponsibly. First of all, because there is no real alternative for Russia, for Assad. I mean, Assad right now is a minor evil for Moscow, because if you have no Assad in Syria, then who will run the country? Who will maintain a sort of stability? Who will protect the minorities from the onslaught which is on the horizon right now? The Alawites are now fighting for their lives, not for Assad, but for their lives. They are simply afraid to abandon him, because without him there will be no one to protect him. There are no for example, there are no peacekeepers who can fight for them. There are no troops of any sort to protect them. So Assad is their only hope. Though they're not happy with him. There are lots of Alawites among the opposition, but among the moderate opposition, which stands for political transformation, not for revolution, not for rebellion. And these forces actually were left behind. No, I'm speaking about the moderate Syrian opposition. They're not in the dialogue. We have Islamists, which are supported by the West, and we have some jihadists, and we have Assad, but no real moderate opposition which is ready for political transformation, which is looking for a peaceful solution in Syria.
Well, that's a rather sad picture, and here I again pass the word to Washington. Probably Dean Ahmed and my colleague Rick Young will give us some more ground for optimism. Rick, you have the word.
Well, thank you, Dmitry. My guest, Dr. Dean Ahmed, has a question for John Higginson in London. Doctor?
It was not a question, it was a comment.
Or comment, I should say.
That I liked his point about asking whether we expect the moderates to combat the extremists. My own view is that you don't combat the extremists by aiding the moderates. In a situation like this, you have to understand that you have people who are forced to be on the same side by the battle they're in at the moment. And they are, the fact is that while there are more moderates than there are extremists, I firmly believe that, but the fact is that the extremists have been more effective on the ground in Syria. And there is no way that the moderates are going to keep weapons away from the extremists as long as the extremists are shooting at whom they consider to be the bad guys. And we've seen this throughout history. When the United States was involved in Afghanistan, they did not make any serious attempt to prevent weapons from going to Osama bin Laden as long as he was fighting against the Soviets. Nor would it have made any sense to have done that. He had some effectiveness, and that's all they cared about at the time. And I think that that's the situation that we're seeing here now. Again, I go back to the fact that it is certainly true, as Nikolay has said, that this is not the Cold War era. But to me, the difference that it's made is that it's flipped sides. During the Cold War era, remember, it was the West that cared so much about stability. It was the Soviets who wanted to see revolution and rebellion. Now, it is the Soviets who are so concerned about, it's the Russians who are so concerned about stability. And it is the West that is beginning to adopt the view that, well, maybe rebellion will give us an advantage. And they were very slow to come to this position, by the way. It wasn't that long ago that they were defending another Middle Eastern dictator, Mubarak, on the grounds of stability. They did not defend what Mubarak was doing. They didn't say, we think he's the greatest leader.
He simply brought stability.
He brings stability, and that's very important.
Well, John, do you have a response?
One point I'd add to that is the actual geography. Russia is so much closer to Syria than Britain is, and I think if Britain was the one that was closer, we'd have a lot more to say about stability. You don't want your neighbour to be in an unstable situation in many ways. But again, the point he made on arming of Osama bin Laden, it was obviously the Brits, Britons that armed Osama bin Laden. It was Britain that armed the Taliban. And now we're still in Afghanistan fighting them. So I think that's one reason why Britons are against sending weapons over. Are we going to be in the same situation again? If the rebels did win, are they going to turn that way? Are we going to have to go in and fight again? We just don't know. So
but
that's the point now.
I'd like to pick up on that, though, and put something out to all of our panelists, if I may, which is, if you look at the G8 itself, is it 7 + 1 in essence? Are we sort of dancing around this issue that actually within the G8, only Russia takes the view that it does? None of the others do. Therefore, isn't the Russian position the minority view within the G8, and is Russia isolated within the G8 because of the view that it holds on Syria?
Well, it is certainly isolated. I mean, that was I think that was made quite clear that it was a seven against one. I mean, what we saw from Cameron, I don't know if the international community saw it, but there was a quite subtle message that he gave afterwards, partly because he knows he's already promised that in order to arm the rebels, he would have to go through Parliament. Parliament has already signalled that they won't give him backing. So he's got a secondary way of trying to beat Assad, which is by putting a message out there to his troops, to the soldiers and the Assad regime, that we will back you even though we're not backing Assad. So I think that is trying to do that propaganda message, which is sometimes the only way to topple a leader is through propaganda, and so much of war is about propaganda.
Perhaps, Dmitry, perhaps your guest,
Moscow intervene here?
please do, please.
Moscow was so isolated as it looked on the surface at the summit, because when you read Western press, and especially when you read readers' reactions to the mainstream Western newspapers, their articles on Syria, you see lots of people actually supporting Russia's point of view. And even when you look at the statements of Western leaders, you see doubt. For example, Cameron, he says he's happy that the moratorium, the embargo on weapons deliveries to Syria has expired. But then he says he had made no decision to supply weapons or not to supply weapons. So it's quite clear that, these doubts that you see in the West, they signal that Russia is not quite isolated. What's your take on that? And do you believe that it's realistic to expect from Mr. Putin what, the Western powers probably expect from him? It's clear that they don't expect him just to bring Assad to the talks in Geneva. Assad already said that his representatives would go there if talks are held.
That's
it
true.
looks like they expect Putin to convince Assad to capitulate. Do you think it's realistic?
Yes, that's what everybody wants. Everybody wants Russia to go to Mr. Assad and tell him, now resign. But you have to keep in mind that Mr. Assad is relying not only on Russia, he is also relying on Iran, which is providing huge support. From my personal point of view, Iranian support is much more important in the current situation, much more important than any kind of Russian help, which I think is very limited. And, putting pressure on Russia in that respect is useless, because Russian position is a position of reason, not a position of any kind of political ambition. And what we see in the West now is that Western leaders are doubtful whether the game is worth the candles, because the crisis is getting bloodier and bloodier, and it is long, very long, in comparison with Libya or Tunisia or Egypt. And they are really looking for a way out of this crisis, but they can't just accept Russian position. They have to keep, to keep their faces, to keep their honor.
Yes, to say it's a safe facing,
exactly.
safe face gesture. Yeah, you're right.
So, and they can't just give up on insisting Assad resignation. So that's a deadlock. That's a deadlock which can't be just broken very easily. That's what everybody's really looking for, a sort of a way out of this deadlock. The best way, of course, is to get rid of Assad and to bring another government to Syria. But,
it's not realistic at the moment.
You can't just make Assad leave. He must make this decision, and he won't make it until he's convinced that he lost the game. And I don't think that he will do this. So the fighting will go on unless somebody changes position, either Russia, either Iran, either the West. So
Dr. Dean Ahmed here in Washington also has a point about Iran, Doctor.
G8 is divided 7-1 on the question of whether Assad should stay in power. That the 7 are divided about how you go about bringing Assad out. And that's why I go back to my point about how one can appeal to Russia. And despite the fact that Nikolay is correct that we reached a situation now where you can't ignore Iran, we went through a period maybe when Iran was not as important, when Hezbollah was not in Syria. Now it's become absolutely critical. But I think that the same kind of appeal can be made to Iran as can be made to Russia. If we were to convince Iran, and by the way, with the recent elections, we have an opportunity to do that. We have a new president of Iran, and we can take advantage of that as an excuse to bring in negotiations and say to Iran, look, we are not trying to drive a wedge between you and Syria as allies. What we want to do is put an end to the horrible civilian humanitarian crisis that's taking place. And we want you to recognize that as long as you're supporting Assad, you are enabling that. And all we're asking you to do, like we're asking Russia, stop supporting Assad as an incentive for the rest of the regime to be willing to accept that as an opportunity to put in some kind of reforms that will allow them to have a place in the government, maybe in the short term continue to stay in power, but will put an end to the humanitarian crisis.
Reaction?
Putting pressure on Assad, putting pressure on Putin, on Iran, but nobody speaks about putting pressure on Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are providing weapons, no matter what the position of the West is. So more weapons will be flowing there unless West works with its allies in the region and stops the flow of arms coming from the Gulf.
And not only Saudi Arabia, but probably Qatar also.
I've mentioned Qatar, yes.
Well, I think that we have heard all sides here, and I think it was really a very interesting conversation. We covered just about all the topics. Now I'm passing the word to London. Scott, maybe your guest would like to say a few words before we wrap it up.
John Higginson, when we look at the future, actually, where things go from here, the strategy of the G8 was to agree on what we could agree on, essentially, in the final communique. Take from that what you will, but that's essentially what they tried to do. Everyone agrees that the violence needs to end. They disagree about how you get there. In terms of the politics of it and a political process, is there any realistic hope for meaningful peace talks?
Well, I think all these I think what needs to be done is, rather than having the G8, many of whom don't have key players in it, we need to get the key players, the Russians and the Iranians that are arming the Assad regime, the Saudis and the Qataris who are arming the rebels. There's only so much countries that really don't have any direct involvement in it can do, and we need to be saying, why aren't you guys sat around the table right now? Why aren't you guys just discussing this rather than having a pseudo war with each other in another country, which is what it's rapidly becoming?
Were you surprised that no date was set for further peace talks? I mean, everyone agrees that the Geneva talks are what is needed, but there's no firm.
No, I mean on that day that the communique came out, I read again the communique from Geneva in June of last year, exactly 12 months ago. It was financial secretaries at that time rather than leaders, but it was so similar, and it's moved on so little, and so many people have died since that it wasn't surprising, but it was still quite depressing how little's moved on since then.
Do Western governments need to prepare themselves for a future Syria which includes Assad?
I think it would be extremely embarrassing and hard for both Cameron and Barack Obama to say that was our red line and we've ignored our red line, but it might be something that would happen, yeah.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for on this program on The Voice of Russia. My thanks today to my guest, John Higginson here in London. Rick Young had Dr. Dean Ahmed, the president of the Minaret of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And in Moscow, Dmitry Babych was joined by Nikolay Surkov. Coming up next on The Voice of Russia, Alice Lanyado and Julian Gallant are here with Curtain Up, a weekly look at Russian culture in London. They'll be speaking with Robert Chandler, the prize-winning translator of Russian literature. But for now, from me and the rest of the team here at The Voice of Russia, thanks for listening, and don't forget to check our website, ruvr.co.uk, for the very latest on all the stories we're covering for you here at The Voice of Russia in London.